It started with silence, but not the comforting kind. Not the gentle silence that wraps around you like a warm blanket on a winter evening. Not the peaceful silence of a forest at dawn. Not the reverential silence of a chapel filled with whispered prayers. No, this silence was sharp, electric, dangerous, the kind that slices through a television studio like a knife through taut fabric. It was the silence of a moment frozen in time, a collective holding of breath, a sudden vacuum where laughter and banter had been just seconds before. Whoopi Goldberg sat frozen in her signature chair, her usually expressive face caught in an uncharacteristic stillness, her eyes blinking too fast, betraying the racing thoughts behind them. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles just a shade whiter than normal. Her co-hosts, normally so poised and camera-ready, exchanged tight, worried glances, small, almost imperceptible nods, and raised eyebrows that spoke volumes in their professional shorthand. Their bodies angled ever so slightly away from the center of the storm, a subconscious retreat. The audience, a sea of faces that had just seconds ago been laughing along with practiced enthusiasm, was now dead still. Their expressions transformed from entertainment to something deeper, more primal, witnesses to an unscripted moment of truth they hadn't paid to see but couldn't look away from. The usual coughs, whispers and rustling of a live studio audience had vanished, replaced by a tension so thick it seemed to have weight and substance. And there, standing calmly under the hot, unforgiving studio lights, was Keanu Reeves. He stood with that distinctive posture of his, neither rigid nor slouched but grounded, present, as if he had roots extending deep below the polished studio floor. His dark hair fell in those familiar waves around his face, framing eyes that held a quiet intensity that cameras both loved and feared. His fingers lightly touched the simple silver cross around his neck, not in a theatrical gesture but with the unconscious familiarity of a talisman long carried. He wasn't angry. There was no flush to his cheeks, no tension in his jaw, no fire in his eyes. He wasn't flustered. His breathing remained even, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. He was something far more dangerous in the world of daytime television, completely, utterly unshaken. In an industry built on reactions, on drama, on the manufactured moments of conflict and resolution, his stillness was revolutionary. You could hear the tension breathing in the studio. It was palpable, alive, a presence that filled the space between heartbeats. The cameras caught it all live and raw. Every micro-expression, every moment of genuine human reaction, every second of unscripted reality breaking through the polished veneer of entertainment. And as the internet would later say, with tweets and posts and endless comment threads dissecting this moment from every angle, Hollywood just met its reckoning, and his name was Keanu. But before this moment that would break the internet and send hashtags screaming across every platform like digital wildfire, something smaller happened. Something quiet, unassuming, seemingly insignificant in the grand tapestry of celebrity interactions. It began, as so many pivotal moments do, with a simple email delivered to Keanu's management team 3 weeks earlier. The message arrived with a professionally designed letterhead and a cordial tone that masked its true intent. "We'd love to have you join us for a thoughtful discussion on generational values in America." The subject line read, "Invitation to the View, Cultural Conversation Series," innocuous enough to pass a cursory glance. The producers had crafted it carefully, with just the right balance of respect and challenge, the subtle hint of controversy wrapped in velvet language. In the sleek, minimalist conference room of Keanu's management agency, his team gathered around a polished table, tablets and coffee cups scattered between them, to discuss the invitation. The room smelled faintly of espresso and expensive cologne, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Los Angeles sprawling below them like a glittering circuit board. "This feels off," one of his assistants muttered. A woman who had been with him for nearly a decade, who had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense a trap disguised as an opportunity. She tapped a manicured nail on the tablet screen, eyeing the carefully constructed wording with the wariness of someone who had seen this particular dance before. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper, though there was no one else to hear. Whoopi's nice on camera, sure. She's a professional, but she's been sharpening that sarcasm for years. 2 decades of verbal sparring with the best and worst of Hollywood. They don't want a conversation. They want a soundbite. They want you to snap, to get flustered, to say something they can clip and circulate until it takes on a life of its own. The room fell quiet as all eyes turned to Keanu, who sat at the end of the table, reading the email again, his expression giving away nothing. The silence stretched for 1 beat, 2, 3. The kind of comfortable silence that only exists among people who have no need to fill it with unnecessary words. Finally, Keanu smiled gently, the expression warming his eyes before reaching his lips. He closed the tablet and pushed his chair back, standing with that fluid grace that had made him a natural for action roles. He adjusted the worn leather strap of his messenger bag, the same one he'd carried for years, despite numerous offers of designer replacements. The leather was soft, cracked at the edges, bearing the invisible imprint of all the places it had been. "Then I won't give them a sound bite," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive cadence, soft, yet somehow reaching every corner of the room. "I'll give them something real." The team exchanged glances, some worried, some resigned, some secretly thrilled at the unpredictability of their most famous client. They knew that look in his eyes, that quiet determination that no amount of Hollywood strategy could redirect once it took hold. What Keanu didn't say, what remained unspoken but felt deep in his bones like an ancient truth, was something more profound. Sometimes a storm walks into a room not to cause chaos, but to clear the air. Sometimes the most powerful force isn't the one that shouts and demands attention, but the one that stands unmoved while the world rages around it. He had learned this not from acting coaches or media training, but from the long, silent years of his own grief, his own journey through darkness towards something resembling peace. By the time he walked onto the stage in his signature black blazer and simple grey tee, an outfit simultaneously worth thousands and appearing completely unassuming, social media was already swirling with anticipation. Producers had strategically leaked his upcoming appearance 3 days earlier, just enough time for the digital ecosystem to build a perfect storm of expectation and debate. Why is the show hosting someone like Keanu Reeves? Liberal commentators questioned, their perfectly crafted tweets garnering thousands of retweets within minutes. His silence on key issues makes him complicit. He's too quiet, too spiritual, too disconnected from the real battles being fought every day. Their critiques carried the familiar rhythm of practiced outrage, the expected notes of a song played too many times. Conservative platforms countered with equal fervor, their warnings spread across forums and video commentaries. "They're setting him up. Watch closely. They'll try to make him look like a fool, to ambush him with gotcha questions. It's what they always do to anyone who doesn't play by their rules." Their protective stance less about Keanu himself and more about the ongoing cultural war they perceived in every interaction. But Keanu wasn't there for either side of this exhausting binary battle. He hadn't come to be a warrior for any ideology or a mouthpiece for any perspective but his own. He was there for the in-between, the millions of viewers who felt increasingly homeless in the polarized landscape of American discourse, the people forgotten in the noise, the quiet majority who didn't fit neatly into the boxes social media algorithms had created for them. As he crossed the brightly lit stage, his steps measured and unhurried, the studio lights caught the silver threads beginning to appear at his temples, evidence of the years he had lived, the experiences that had shaped him beyond the roles that had made him famous. He shook hands with each co-host, his grip firm but not dominating, his smile genuine, if reserved. When he reached Whoopi, their eyes met for a fraction longer than socially necessary. 2 veterans of an industry that chewed up authenticity and repackaged it as entertainment. 2 souls who had seen the machinery behind the magic. She smiled back at him, that wide showbiz grin she had mastered over decades in the spotlight. Warm, inviting, with just the right amount of teeth showing. But something in her eyes, a calculating sharpness behind the practiced warmth, betrayed her true intentions. Like a chess player already seeing 5 moves ahead, she was setting up her pieces, preparing for the moment that would generate the clip, the sound bite, the viral moment that would feed the content machine for days to come. Keanu recognized it immediately. He had seen that look before, in directors who wanted to push him further than the script required, in journalists who phrased questions as compliments but hid traps within them, in industry executives who smiled while watching the bottom line more than the art. He didn't judge it. This was the game, after all. But he had long ago decided that while he would play the game when necessary, he would never be played by it. The opening pleasantries were polite, scripted. But then the temperature shifted. "So, Keanu," Whoopi began, her tone light but edged, "you still wearing that cross around your neck? I thought the Matrix made you a little more evolved than that." The audience chuckled nervously. It was framed as a joke, but the undercurrent was clear. She was mocking him. Keanu didn't blink. "I wear it," he said softly, "because it reminds me that there's something bigger than fame, bigger than me." The crowd stirred. Some clapped, others went still. Whoopi tilted her head, still smiling, but the warmth was gone. "But don't you think with everything going on in the world, maybe it's time we left those old myths behind?" That was the moment. You could feel it coming like a storm swell about to break. Keanu leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "The world doesn't need fewer beliefs, Whoopi. It needs better ones." And just like that, you felt the momentum shift. A few people in the audience gasped. One man in the third row whispered, "Whoa," just loud enough for his mic to catch it. From backstage, a camera tech mouthed to another, "He's flipping the room." Keanu looked around the studio, at the lights, the audience, the cameras, and then back at Whoopi. "You know," he said, almost whispering, "you can laugh at symbols, but you can't erase the meaning behind them. People have survived on hope long before there was applause." The line landed like thunder, not shouted, not performative, just true. Whoopi's smile faltered. Her hands gripped her cards a little tighter. Keanu just sat there, composed, steady, and deeply present. And for the first time in a long time on the show, the power didn't belong to the host. It belonged to the guest who didn't come to fight, but came carrying a truth no one was ready to face. Whoopi adjusted in her seat, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face, but she masked it with a grin. "Well," she said, her voice trying to reclaim its usual rhythm, "you sure came loaded with philosophy today." The audience gave a half-hearted chuckle, but it didn't roll through the studio like usual. There was tension in the room now, thin, stretched, electric. Keanu just tilted his head, his expression unreadable but calm. "I didn't come here with philosophy," he said quietly. "I came with experience." The way he said it, soft, grounded, cut deeper than any debate. It wasn't just a clapback. It was a reminder, a line of lived truth in a space too used to scripted outrage. Whoopi tried to pivot, flipping through her note cards. "Let's talk about something lighter," she said, her voice tightening. "You've played heroes, rebels, even a cyber messiah. But tell me, how much of that is just an act? At what point does the actor start believing he's a savior?" The room flinched. There it was, a calculated strike. Keanu's expression didn't change. He waited, let it hang, then leaned in slightly, eyes steady. "None of it. But the day I stopped pretending I was invincible is the day I found strength." Whoopi blinked. The crowd was silent again. He wasn't playing their game. He was rewriting the rules mid-show, and that made her nervous. "So what? You're just here to teach us a lesson?" she shot back, her tone losing patience. "You think carrying that little cross makes you better than the rest of us?" Keanu didn't flinch. No, he said. It reminds me I'm no better than anyone, and no worse. It's not armor, it's a mirror. And then came the first real crack. Whoopi's smirk dropped just a little too far. She reached for a water glass that wasn't there. A producer scrambled to get one but tripped over a cable. In the control room, someone muttered, "We're losing the pacing." And in the audience, the shift was palpable. People weren't just watching, they were choosing. A few heads nodded. Someone whispered, "He's right." Another audience member, a woman in her 60s near the back row, wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Keanu wasn't preaching, he was remembering. And in doing so, making others remember too. Whoopi leaned back, trying again. "So then, explain this," she said, grabbing onto her next card like it was a lifeline. "You're spiritual, but you've worked in an industry known for vanity, excess, abuse. How do you reconcile that?" Keanu took a breath. "You mean, how do I live in darkness and still light a candle?" She didn't respond. He continued, "Because if you only shine where it's safe, that's not light. That's performance." There was a pause, heavy and honest. It wasn't a zinger. It wasn't designed to go viral, but it would. A woman in the front row stood up slowly. She didn't say a word, just stood and nodded. The kind of nod that comes from years of carrying invisible weight. Whoopi tried to joke it off, her voice rising just a little too high. "So now we're all doing church, huh?" The line didn't land. It thudded. And that's when Keanu did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a faded photo. Creased, old. "This was my sister," he said. "She taught me to pray before I ever knew what I was praying for." He held it up, not for sympathy, but as a symbol. "She passed when I was still figuring things out, but she believed in me when I didn't. That's why I still wear this," he said, touching the cross again. "Not for the crowd, for her." And just like that, the room broke. Not into applause, into silence. A silence so full it felt like a sound of its own. Whoopi froze. Her card stack trembled slightly in her hand, and the camera zoomed just close enough to catch the moisture at the corner of her eye, even as she tried to blink it away. But this wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about ratings or viral clips or dunking on someone live. This was about truth. The quiet kind. The kind that walks in without warning and sits down like it's always had a seat. The audience didn't laugh. They didn't cheer. They listened. And in that moment, the most powerful voice in the room wasn't the host. It was the guest who wasn't afraid of silence. The silence clung to the studio like fog, thick and unmoving, as if the walls themselves were processing what had just been said. Whoopi glanced toward the producers, looking for a cue, a lifeline, anything to help her pull the show back into her control. But no one moved, no one spoke. Keanu simply sat still, hands folded, the faded photo now resting on the arm of his chair, the edges curled from time and memory. He wasn't grandstanding. He wasn't seeking applause. He was holding space for grief, for truth, for the millions watching who had never seen this kind of moment on daytime television. And Whoopi knew it. Her voice, when she finally spoke again, was tighter, sharper. "That's a touching story," she said, the sarcasm barely veiled. "But let's be real here. You're a Hollywood actor. You make millions. You fly private. You live in a bubble. What makes you think you can speak for anyone who's actually struggling?" The question was sharp, pointed, designed to turn the crowd, but it didn't. Keanu looked directly at her, not offended, not shaken. "Because I've struggled," he replied simply, "and not just emotionally. I've slept in cars. I've lost the people I love most, and I've walked into rooms where people only saw my past, never my presence." He paused, letting the words land. "You think money makes you immune to pain? Then you've never lost something that can't be replaced." A murmur rippled through the audience. Whoopi shifted in her chair, her body language tightening, coiling. This wasn't going as planned. Her attempt to corner him had only exposed her own assumptions. But she wasn't done. "So what?" she said with a forced laugh. "Now you're the spokesperson for morality, for suffering? You're going to save us all with a sad story and a necklace?" Keanu leaned back slightly, not in retreat but in control. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not here to save anyone. I'm here because someone watching this right now needs to know they're not alone. That even in rooms like this, rooms built for applause and interruption, truth can still take up space." Then he turned to the camera, not dramatically, not with flair, but with the quiet power of someone who has nothing to prove and everything to give. If you've ever been talked down to, laughed at, told you were too old-fashioned, too sensitive, too spiritual, if you've ever felt small for believing in something bigger, this moment is for you. He held that gaze, steady and sure, as if he could see straight through the lens and into the living rooms of the people watching at home. And then the twist came. A voice from the audience, clear, young and trembling, broke the quiet. "I used to believe," the voice said, "but then the world told me it was stupid." All heads turned. A young man, maybe early 20s, stood slowly. "Watching this, hearing you, it makes me want to try again." The studio froze. Whoopi's face tightened. She reached for the next card, but her hands were shaking now just barely. "Let's take a break," she muttered into the camera. But the director didn't cut. The moment was too real, too raw, and too viral to interrupt. Keanu looked at the young man and simply nodded. "Then don't let the world tell you who you are. Let your actions speak louder." Another murmur, another ripple. This wasn't just a TV segment anymore. This was a cultural shift playing out live. The comments online were exploding. "Keanu just baptized daytime television." "Whoopi just got humbled." "Faith is back and it's wearing a black blazer." Desperate to pivot, Whoopi forced a laugh and tried one last swing. All right, enough with the church. Let's talk politics. You worked on films that preach peace, but you've stayed silent on so many issues. Why? Afraid to upset your fans?" Keanu didn't smile. "I speak when it's honest. I stay silent when it's noise." He leaned forward again, eyes locked. "The real question isn't why I don't scream about everything. It's why we keep demanding outrage instead of understanding." And with that, the final dynamic began to flip. Viewers at home weren't just entertained. They were moved. The audience wasn't laughing, they were listening. And Whoopi, for the first time in years on that set, wasn't in control. The show had started as hers, but the room now belonged to someone who didn't come to dominate, but to awaken. And people everywhere could feel it. The tension in the studio had thickened into something you could almost taste. Even the air seemed heavier, like the lights were suddenly too bright, the silence too loud. Whoopi sat straighter, eyes darting to the side, likely hoping the producers would call for a commercial, but the red recording light stayed on. They weren't going to cut, not when this was clearly becoming the kind of unscripted television moment that explodes across every corner of the internet. Keanu, still calm, still composed, sat unmoved. He didn't need to lean into the chaos. It was already swirling around him, and somehow he remained the quiet eye of the storm. "So now you're the voice of wisdom?" Whoopi snapped, her tone less playful, more defensive. "You really think that just because you've lost people, just because you've got a sob story and a necklace, you get to talk down to everyone else?" Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "I don't think I'm above anyone," he said, his voice like calm water over sharp rocks. "But I do think there's a sickness in the culture when compassion is mocked and faith is treated like a punchline." Whoopi smirked, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Or maybe," she fired back, "some of us are just tired of being told we're broken because we don't believe in the same fairy tales." That was the moment. the moment she crossed the line, and everyone in the room knew it. A low murmur rolled through the audience. Someone in the second row gasped audibly. A co-host looked away, suddenly focused on her notepad. Keanu sat perfectly still, his fingers gently brushing the cross at his chest. "You call it a fairy tale," he said softly. "But to me, it was the only thing I had left when the world broke me. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase pain. But it gave me something to hold on to when nothing else would." He turned just slightly, addressing the audience now. "And I know I'm not alone. Some of you have lost more than I ever have. Some of you are holding on by a thread. And if all you have is belief, hold it tight. Don't let this world shame you for having hope." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it hit harder than any scream. The audience began to shift, literally. People leaned in. A woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A man near the aisle gave a tiny, respectful nod. Then, from the far side of the set, a staffer, barely in his 20s, stepped just into the edge of the shot and said, "He's right." Whoopi turned sharply. "Excuse me?" The young man didn't back down. "He's right," he repeated. "I grew up watching this show, but I've never seen anyone be that honest on this stage. Maybe we need more of that." The studio went dead silent, and then came another twist. A message appeared on the screen, an overlay the producers had planned for a later segment, but someone backstage had flipped it early. It was from a teenage viewer, submitted before the show aired. It read, "I'm struggling with depression. If you're talking about hope, please don't make it a joke." The timing was eerie. Perfect. Devastating. The crowd murmured again, this time not in discomfort but in realization. Whoopi tried to pivot, but her voice cracked ever so slightly. "Well, this show took a turn," she muttered. But even that fell flat. Keanu looked at her, not with anger, not with superiority, but with something that almost looked like sadness. "No," he said. "It didn't take a turn. It arrived where it needed to go. We spend so much time avoiding real conversations that when one finally happens, we act like it's a mistake." He stood slowly, not in protest, not in exit, but to reclaim his presence. "I didn't come here to preach or to win. I came here because someone out there might be listening, and if they are, I want them to know they're not crazy for still believing in something." The camera panned to Whoopi, who sat frozen, her script scattered in her lap. She had no words, no comeback, no defense. The power dynamic had crumbled entirely. And the crowd, they didn't erupt in applause. They rose in silence one by one, row by row, giving Keanu something far more powerful than claps. They gave him attention, respect, stillness, the kind of standing ovation you only see at funerals and revolutions. Keanu stood at the edge of the stage now, not grandstanding, not soaking in the moment, just being. The stillness he carried wasn't performative, it was the kind of presence that fills a room without trying. The audience, fully upright, stayed silent, as if making noise would somehow cheapen what they had just witnessed. And Whoopi, she remained seated, visibly smaller now, her note cards abandoned on her lap like remnants of a battle she didn't realize she was losing until it was too late. Her eyes followed him cautiously, as if unsure whether to speak, apologize, or just let him leave. But Keanu didn't move toward the exit. Instead, he stepped forward, closer to her, not aggressively, not to confront, but to finish what had been started. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone," he said, his voice warm but grounded. "You invited me, and I came because I thought we were going to have a conversation." Whoopi let out a shallow breath, the kind you take when your pride is bruised, but your heart is still fighting to catch up. "We were," she said, voice lower now, "but it got deeper than expected." Keanu nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what we've all forgotten how to do. Go deeper. We're so used to sparring, shouting, cancelling, clapping back. We forgot how to just sit in something uncomfortable until it teaches us something." The crowd shifted again, not in noise but in posture. People were listening now, not just to a celebrity, but to a human being speaking directly to the parts of them that longed to be understood. Keanu continued, "I didn't always believe. I had years where I felt nothing but emptiness. No faith, no purpose, just anger and numbness. But then I met people who didn't try to fix me. They just stayed. They sat with me in the dark until I found my own light." He turned to Whoopi, who was now visibly emotional. "You don't have to believe what I believe, but don't mock the only thing that's kept some people alive." It landed like a meteor, heavy, final. The audience, already fragile from the weight of the last few minutes, began to break. You could hear muffled sobs. A few people bowed their heads, not out of shame but out of reverence. One elderly man in the second row whispered to his wife, "This isn't a talk show anymore. It's something else." Meanwhile, in the control room, the producers were frozen. One of them, an executive with decades in the industry, muttered, "We just lost the format, but we gained history." And that's when Whoopi cracked. Her hand went to her face, not in a dramatic gesture, but to catch a tear she hadn't expected to fall. "I didn't mean to make it personal," she said, voice raw. "Sometimes we get so used to being on camera, we forget how to be real." Keanu didn't respond with triumph. He didn't smile. He simply nodded. Being real is risky, but it's the only thing worth doing. Then came the unexpected moment. A producer walked on stage, something never done live, and handed Keanu a phone. "There's a message you need to see," he said quietly. The screen showed a tweet already going viral. It read, "I was about to end my life today. Then I watched Keanu Reeves talk about pain and belief. I'm still here. Thank you." Gasps filled the room. Whoopi's hand dropped to her lap. The audience no longer saw a celebrity. They saw a lifeline, a man who didn't come to entertain them, but to interrupt their numbness. Keanu handed the phone back and took one last look around the room. If all I did today was remind someone that pain doesn't make them broken, then it was worth it. And then, almost as if the studio needed one final breath, a slow ripple of applause began. It wasn't explosive, it wasn't even coordinated, it was reverent, respectful, the kind you hear in places where people have been changed, not entertained. Whoopi, still seated, looked up at him with something that resembled admiration, or maybe just recognition. "You didn't come here for a moment," she said. "You came here to mean something." Keanu simply replied, "We all should." And with that, the show didn't end with a slogan or a flashy outro. It ended with the kind of silence that lingers, the kind that says, "Something sacred just happened here." The stage was still bathed in studio lights, but no one seemed to notice them anymore. The applause had faded into a hush that felt almost spiritual, like the entire room had entered some unspoken agreement to protect the gravity of what had just unfolded. Whoopi Goldberg, once the unshakable queen of daytime television, sat unusually quiet, her hands clasped together in her lap, her signature wit nowhere to be found. Keanu hadn't humiliated her. He hadn't tried to. That's what made it worse. He had disarmed her not with anger or ego but with grace, and somehow in doing so, he had turned her stage into something she could no longer control. Backstage, the crew was scrambling. Social media was detonating. TikTok was already flooded with clipped moments, the cross moment, Whoopi's silence, Keanu's masterclass in humility. One video had over 3 million views in just under an hour. Tweets poured in. Keanu didn't win an argument. He changed the room. That wasn't a debate, that was a reckoning. And, perhaps most telling of all, he didn't raise his voice, he raised the bar. On set, Whoopi finally spoke, but this time it wasn't for the audience. Her words were soft, almost unsure. "You said something earlier," she said, not making eye contact yet, "about people needing to feel seen. I think maybe I forgot how to do that." Keanu looked at her with the same steady calm he had held since the moment he walked in. "We all forget," he said, "but the good news is, we can remember." There was a long pause, not awkward, but necessary. Then she lifted her head, eyes misty, and offered a small, fragile smile. "You've got people crying in here, Reeves. That's not supposed to happen at 10 in the morning." A few people chuckled softly, but it wasn't laughter at her expense. It was the sound of a room slowly exhaling. Keanu didn't respond with a quip. He simply nodded. Sometimes it takes just one person to stop performing so everyone else can finally breathe. Whoopi gave a half laugh, half sigh, the kind that comes from being knocked off your pedestal but knowing it was deserved. "You came here with a mission," she said, "and I think you did more than you meant to." He glanced around at the cameras, the crew, the audience now seated again but visibly changed. "I didn't come here to change the world," he said, "just to remind it that being kind, being real, being faithful, those aren't weaknesses. They're the strongest things we've got left." Then came a shift that no one expected. Whoopi turned slightly toward the camera, looked directly into the lens, and for the first time in what felt like years, dropped the persona. "If you're watching this," she said, "and you've ever felt like your faith, your grief, or your quiet strength made you an outsider, maybe we got it wrong. Maybe we've been laughing at the wrong things." The camera didn't cut. The control room didn't interrupt. It was too late to pretend this was still a talk show. This had become something else entirely. From her earpiece, a producer's voice whispered, "We need to wrap." Whoopi hesitated, then ignored it. She looked at Keanu again, and this time with full honesty. "Thank you. Not for coming on the show, but for not becoming who they wanted you to be." Keanu gave the faintest smile, the kind that held 1,000 unspoken things. "They didn't invite me to be who I am, but that's who showed up anyway." That line would later be printed on T-shirts, quoted in interviews, even used by college professors in lectures about integrity. But in that moment, it wasn't a slogan. It was just the truth. And as the final moments of the live segment ticked away, Keanu turned to the audience one last time. "We've built a culture where mocking people is a sport," he said, voice steady. "But what if the bravest thing we can do now is care?" He looked directly into the camera again. "So if this made you think, if it made you feel something, don't scroll past it. Share it. Comment. Start a conversation. Not about me, about what matters." The screen faded to black, not with applause, not with music, but with a still image of Keanu standing, head slightly bowed, cross visible, and a simple caption. "Sometimes the quietest man in the room has the loudest truth." And for the first time in a long time, daytime television didn't just go viral. It went real. The moment the screen faded to black, the internet lit up like wildfire. Within minutes, clips of Keanu's calm yet devastating words were circulating on every major platform. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, every feed was flooded with a single question. Did Whoopi just get humbled on her own show? But that question quickly gave way to something deeper, something more important. Why did this hit so hard? And why does it feel like he said what we've all been trying to say? Keanu didn't deliver a monologue. He delivered a mirror, and what people saw in it stopped them cold. Backstage, Whoopi sat quietly in her dressing room, no longer trying to defend what had happened. The makeup crew had retreated. The producers were whispering down the hall, and the atmosphere was one of emotional aftershock. She wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She was simply quiet. For someone who had made a career out of talking, that silence said everything. She stared into the mirror in front of her, the one framed with bright vanity bulbs, and whispered to herself, "Maybe it's time I start listening more." Meanwhile, Keanu sat in a modest folding chair in a hallway, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. He hadn't asked for a private room, a security escort, or any special treatment. He just sat there, the same way he had walked onto the stage, unbothered, grounded. His team scrolled through the online reactions, occasionally showing him the more moving ones. Veterans talking about how they felt seen, teenagers sharing their own stories of quiet faith, single mothers commenting, "Finally, someone who speaks without shouting." News outlets couldn't get the clips up fast enough. Conservative media called it a masterclass in moral courage. Liberal media cautiously acknowledged that something undeniably human happened today. Talk shows that normally avoided faith-based topics entirely were now asking, "Is this the return of public humility?" And churches across the country were already requesting permission to show the footage during Sunday service. But Keanu didn't care about headlines. When one of his assistants asked if he wanted to post a reaction, or even a simple thank you on social media, he shook his head and said, "The words already spoke. I don't need to add anything." That's when the emails started coming in, not the standard PR flood, but deeply personal ones. A retired teacher wrote, "You gave me the strength to put my cross back on today." A young man battling addiction said, "I didn't think I mattered until I saw you say that pain doesn't make you broken." A single line from the show, "Maybe we've been laughing at the wrong things," was trending globally within the hour. Then came the call. A network executive from a rival station reached out and offered Keanu his own show, an open-format platform to bring meaningful conversations back to television. He declined, not because he wasn't grateful, but because he knew that what had happened couldn't be packaged, scheduled, or replicated. It wasn't content. It was a cultural reset. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Los Angeles skyline, Keanu walked out of the studio into a growing crowd of supporters who had gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Faith still matters, and you spoke for us." He didn't wave like a politician. He didn't pose for the cameras. He simply walked through them, stopping every few feet to shake hands, to listen, to see them, not just look, but truly see. And as he got into the car, one final message came through from a woman in Georgia. She was a pastor's wife. Her husband had recently passed, and she had been on the brink of giving up everything. The message read, "I watched your interview with tears in my eyes. I don't need to be loud to be strong. Thank you for reminding me of that." Keanu closed the message slowly and looked out the window as the car pulled away. The city lights shimmered like stars scattered across a canvas of exhaustion and hope. The next morning, the show issued a brief statement, not apologizing, but acknowledging that something important happened and promising to create space for more voices like Keanu's. Whoopi herself didn't post anything, not out of pride, but perhaps because she finally realized that some lessons are more powerful when you sit with them in silence. And as for Keanu, he didn't say another word to the press. But those who watched, who listened, who felt, they would carry his words like lanterns in the dark. Not because he was perfect, not because he won, but because in a time of noise, he chose to speak only what mattered, and that was louder than anything.